Welcome to a special edition of the Medicine and Science podcast from the BMJ. I'm Cameron Abbasi, Editor-in-Chief. Baroness Hallett, who is leading the UK COVID inquiry, has just published her second report, which focuses on the government's decision-making during the pandemic. And to dissect that with us, I'm joined in the studio by Rebecca Coombes, who's the BMJ's head of journalism.
Hello.
And Kevin Fong, anaesthetist and lead for major incident planning at University College Hospital.
Hello.
Kevin gave moving testimony, as many of us will remember, to the inquiry, not for this module, but for the next module that we'll be hearing a verdict on, I guess, at some point in the next few months. We're also joined online by Matthew Flinders. Matthew is Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the University of Sheffield.
Good afternoon.
So let's start with Bex. Bex, bring us up to date with an overview of what the inquiry found this week.
Yeah, I mean, just a bit of context as well for the inquiry. So Boris Johnson announced this under extreme pressure in 2021. As you say, it's being led by this former senior appeals judge, Baroness Hallett, who's also a member of the House of Lords. And it's a massive undertaking. It's split into 10 modules, each looking at a different area of impact. And the one that's just reported is module 2. And that's looking at decision-making and political governance. And the report from the first module looked at pandemic preparedness, and it was widely seen as actually quite helpful. And several of its recommendations, such as regular pandemic simulation exercises, have already been adapted. Hearings have been happening since 2023, and they're ongoing. It's costing a huge amount of money. The Institute of Fiscal Studies estimates that it's going to cost over £200 million. And that doesn't include the amount that Whitehall's spending on lawyers. The FT estimated around about 8 million so far on lawyers. So, we want this to be really in depth in its investigations and sort of, transformative in its recommendations. I think we've got a right to expect that.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's been calling for it. I remember we first called for an inquiry in July 2020, but a rapid one.
Yeah.
We finally got one, an independent inquiry.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to know, though, that other countries are making swifter progress. So Sweden's independent commission published its final report on the government's handling of the crisis in February 2022, and the Netherlands, October 2023. We're not going to see an end to this till about 2027. I mean, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's for discussion. But
why is ours taking so long? I guess you can't answer that.
I don't think we've ever attempted a public inquiry like this before. It's so broad in its scope. That's all I know. I mean, say 10 modules, as you said, that the other ones coming up are the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on healthcare systems, looking at vaccines and therapeutics, children. They're all very important areas.
Okay. Are you able to quickly summarise what was announced this week?
Yes, I mean, this latest module has been very critical of Boris Johnson. That's got all the headlines. It's been very damning and unforgivable failures. I think we all know the headlines that UK action was too little, too late, that 23,000 lives could have been saved is the headline if lockdown had been imposed a week earlier. And if restrictions such as contact tracing, self-isolation, household quarantine, face coverings, respiratory hygiene, could have been introduced earlier, we could have avoided a full lockdown.
Okay, well, let's get a reaction from Kevin and Matthew. So, Matthew, what did you make of the verdict from Lady Hallett this week?
Well, I was quite surprised by how strong it was with its core message about too little, too late. In many ways, it underlined a lot of the concerns and issues that were fairly well known, but of course gave us an evidence base and an insight to a level that we didn't quite have previously. And of course, all of this, and this is the great issue, the danger of hindsight bias, that in many ways it's very easy for an independent judicial inquiry to look back and try and understand what went wrong, but to capture the nature of decision making at a very particular moment in time when there are intense pressures, imperfect information going on, that is something that's very hard, I think, sometimes for inquiries to capture. And although I think this inquiry is doing a fantastic job, I think that hindsight bias of not imposing an incredibly rational view on how policy should be made to what is often a messy reality of life.
Okay, first of all, can I just pick you up on, you said you were surprised that it was a bit strong to say too little too late. Why do you say that? Then I'll come back to the point about hindsight bias.
Well, I think the point about too little too late is that there were obviously a whole number of different debates, issues, concerns. It was a fairly new challenge. The system clearly wasn't prepared as it should have been. And one of the things that's quite interesting, particularly in the summary report, is one of the reasons why the system wasn't as prepared as it might have been was because of Brexit. Brexit had such a big impact on Whitehall, draining staff looking at Brexit transfer recovery policies, that in many ways, many of the normal precautionary strategies had been temporarily overlooked. The reason I think it's interesting and goes quite far is some of the comments about the toxic culture at the heart of Whitehall, maybe possibly a language that we wouldn't have expected to have been used, but quite clearly dovetail with what was broadly known about some of the key actors at the time, and about more broadly a rather amateurish approach to governing at the centre of power.
So you're saying that, are you agreeing that there was a toxic culture? So if there was one, why shouldn't she say that?
Well, I think there was a toxic culture, and I would say there were obviously lots of officials and experts trying to work the system as well as could have been done in the context. I'm just thinking that having read a lot of judicial inquiries, the language and tone is slightly stronger than I would have expected.
Okay, yeah, this is pretty full on, pretty direct. On the point of hindsight bias, Kevin might want to comment on this, but in the BMJ, we published a whole bunch of articles around the unfolding pandemic. And there was one that I co-authored in May of 2020. And the strapline to that piece was, in relation to the UK's response, too little, too late, too flawed. And I know the Lancet had something similar. And as the pandemic went through its various stages, I would argue, actually, that it's not hindsight bias. There was a lot of commentary, a lot of analysis, a lot of very rigorous viewpoints and vigorously put viewpoints that were saying that the government is getting this wrong. So, actually, I wouldn't agree with you on that point. Kevin, what's your view of that?
So I have sympathy for the idea of the run into March 2020, February, March 2020, there was a big cloud of uncertainty. I do remember that. And so in a way, one has to think quite carefully about what decisions could and couldn't be made with full clarity. That said, the too little too late statement, I think, applies across the whole of the piece. And she also says, Baroness Hallett also says in her report, that the lessons of the first wave were not learned and were repeated over and over again throughout the whole piece. And so too little too late certainly absolutely applies to the lockdown restrictions that are required on January the 4th, 2021, because by that time you've got a full set of surveillance and data and monitoring up. You've got a very mature set of advisory groups, and yet you still lumber into that one with much more catastrophic consequences than the decisions that were made in the first wave. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on the toxic culture point? Bex, what was your view of that? Did you look into that?
Yeah, the report obviously looks at the toxic culture in Downing Street at lower levels. There are also some criticisms at the scientists and medics involved in some of the decisions. Yeah. I think the allegations of rule breaking by ministers and advisors also sort of undermine confidence in the government at the time. Well, that came out slightly later. There also seems to be like a lack of trust between Johnson and the other devolved governments. Which also didn't help and sort of, affected that kind of collaborative approach to decision making. Okay.
You might want to come back on this, Matthew, but let me just ask Kevin a little bit. Kevin, you talked about how this was the too little too late phrase could be applied kind of throughout. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? What are the other examples of that?
Well, the point about a response like this, that even though it starts with this huge, dense cloud of uncertainty and all of the criticisms one can make, or at least all of the comments one can make about how difficult it is to assemble the whole picture as it kicks off at the start of 2020, that's not true. That's not true later as we head into the autumn. And in fact, I always think of that time as almost the sweet spot for everything, because we have, two variants in play. We have no vaccinations on the pitch. Most of the population hasn't been infected. Our mathematical modelling is as mature as it's going to be for purpose at that time. And so it's never, at any point in the pandemic, I think, more obvious what is about to happen. And yet we do just blunder into it. And I think that cost us very sorely. And so even if one says it's strong language for the first set of decisions, it absolutely isn't for that point there. And Baroness Hallett makes the point that this is a government that fails to learn, and that in itself is the lesson to take away, that if you don't learn as you're in progress, if you don't defer to the expertise that is in the room, then you will repeat your mistakes and it will cost you.
Okay, I'd like to come back to this learning point, but Matthew, I want to bring you in. I was speaking to a former Conservative politician just earlier today, very interested in health, and he was saying to me he felt a bit of sympathy for Boris Johnson over the way he's been criticised in the report. What do you think of that?
Well, I'd be quite surprised to find many people sympathetic towards Boris Johnson and how he's been portrayed in the report. I mean, just going back to the point that was just made about policy learning, I think it's really important that the leadership of the whole COVID response would have always come from the top. And in some ways, it was unfortunate at that time we had a prime minister who was well known, let's say, for a lot of things in life, but not for having a detailed, diligent interest in policy making or the broader administration of the state, or a capacity to learn from experts. So I think there's a really unfortunate confluence of variables here. And the thing about trust is critical. I mean, Boris Johnson never really being part of the Conservative Party, never having really good, close relationships with backbenchers, never really having close working relationships with a lot of the cabinet. And of course, that trust issue, it almost sort of cascade out into the public, that what we know now from international research is countries that fared best tended to have high levels of public trust in the state and political processes. And under Boris Johnson, we just didn't have that confidence amongst the public. And then, of course, Partygate completely broke it completely. So there are different prime ministers and different forms of leaders. And I'm not quite sure when Boris Johnson would have made the right one, but in the middle of the COVID pandemic, he probably had the opposite skills to the ones you needed.
So I actually thought at the start of it, I thought that he was going to do very well. He's so in love with this idea of Churchill and great leadership and being a statesman in times of crisis. I thought this is the moment where you're going to hear these Churchillian, speeches from him. And this is what you wanted him to do, right? The solution to this is to be a leader that can explain to people that action is required, even before it is obvious to the man or woman in the street, in the best interest of the country and what is needed to protect it. You can write this. I'm writing it on the fly now. And he never gave it. And he never showed that leadership. And it just seemed to disintegrate.
Yeah. Just on that particular point, I mean, the person I was speaking to said, well, would any other leader have done anything different? And I argued that back, well, I think probably they would have. And I think the reason I don't give the politicians at that time a free pass before March, for two reasons. Number one, you only had to talk to colleagues in Southeast Asia and attend conferences in Southeast Asia to know how they responded to SARS. Okay, and it was in a very different way to the way we responded to COVID initially, and how aggressive and how well prepared they are for the next time it happens, how aggressively they handled it previously, and how well prepared they are for next time. Secondly, at the BMJ, and Bex, you probably remember this as well. First of all, from China and Wuhan, we were getting report after report about how difficult people were finding dealing with this virus, from hospital doctors struggling to cope with the pressure on hospitals, with the number of people critically ill, intensive care, the number of people dying. And then very soon after, we were bombarded with people calling us from Italy and telling us from ITUs in Italy, hospitals in Italy, about what was happening, about the absolute collapse of the health service, because they were simply inundated with critically ill patients and they were unsure how best to deal with them. So we knew that. It struck me as a bit of a, not quite acceptable that the people running the country did not also have access to that information and that knowledge as well. And from our perspective at the BMJ, we saw the whole thing going in a very kind of worrying direction. And interestingly, a week before lockdown was announced, we said, right, we're all working from home. Right, we can see what's coming. We're all working from home. So I'm not saying, we got it right. We knew what we're talking about. I told you so. My point simply is that I think there were the signals there that could have urged you to act sooner. And we'll get into whether the lockdowns could have been prevented or not in a minute. But yes, it was probably an unprecedented situation in terms of modern day politics. But if you'd actually paid more attention to what you were hearing internationally, then you might have behaved differently.
I would only say that you can't take Module 2 in isolation here in terms of the quality of decision making and whether or not you let the decision makers off the hook, as you put it. Module 1 tells us that we were underprepared. You have a health service that is run to the edges of its adaptive capacity. It has no spare capacity. We, on the eve of COVID, 85% of our intensive care beds are occupied. Our ward beds are 95% occupied routinely during winter. It's with that state that we enter the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the hard decisions, the decisions that are important, have all been made by that point. So that also compounds it. And it is the same administration. So I find it hard to, I think one has to hold one's hand up and say that there was a series of decisions leading up to it and on the eve of it that are now known to have been wrong. And whether or not one is assigning blame, one needs to recognize that in the spirit of learning.
Yeah. You were working clearly, as a hospital doctor in intensive care at that time, in critical care. What were you feeling around that time? Kevin, I know you've talked about it at the inquiry.
So there was huge trepidation. We were seeing scenes out of Wuhan, and I remember very clearly watching a video of them, an intubation team going in and watching what was happening and hearing those reports. I then remember watching Lombardy and Northern Italy get into the trouble they got into and thinking, if this is not hype, if this is not just this over-the-top reporting, we're in massive trouble. I reflect on that time now and the fact that we didn't act, generally with more urgency, as perhaps those are the first stages of some sort of national state of denial. Because this thing has escaped Wuhan, escaped China, escaped Southeast Asia. It's now in Europe. The idea that it's not going to be on top of you and hitting you in the same way seems utterly ludicrous to me now.
Although we had that sense.
Well, we had that sense.
Okay. Matthew, just building on the point about learning, because the point is that we should be learning from an inquiry. Do you think that's really happening the way the response has played out this week?
I think yes is the overall message. I think COVID has been seen as the inquiry that is far too important to overlook, although there is a structural issue here that we had a big inquiry by the House of Lords Special Inquiry on Inquiries not long ago, and its main recommendation was that the vast majority of recommendations from these sort of inquiries are never actually implemented. So one of the big questions coming forward, and I see the actual Baroness Hallett has been very clear to say that the inquiry will monitor the implementation of recommendations until the inquiry ends. The big question is actually, by that point, many of the inquiries the recommendations will be out there hanging. And what structures will there be in place to ensure that any recommendations that are hung over are actually taken forward?
Okay, can I ask you, in terms of learning, what do you think the government should learn from this? I appreciate some of the people who are involved are no longer in government, hence that we've heard their denials this week. But if you were now in government, what should you be learning from what you've heard this week from Hallett?
I think there are two main issues here. One is the science and advisory structures need to be far more robust and put in place, and the government needs to have much clearer objectives and an understanding of what those advisory processes can deliver. Also, I think there's a big issue about the amount of churn in Whitehall. One of the great problems in Whitehall is institutional memory. Huge amounts of ministerial turnover and official turnover often wipe out institutional memory. So things that might have only happened a year or two ago, all the staff have already gone and moved on. So there is a big question about how do we better engage with the science and evidence base? Because to be honest, and to push back on some of the studio discussion, I think it's really important to understand, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but just to get a sense of how intense the Whitehall Westminster bubble is. And to say that, yes, there were things happening all over the world and there were evidence and data emerging. And I'm sure that BMJ were on top of the understanding for a rational response. But political structures often have irrational incentives built into them, which can be very hard to understand from the outside, plus the structures around ministers to give them that expertise can often be very, very weak or problematic. So it's strengthening the scientific advice structures, number one. Secondly, it's doing what it can, which is an age-old issue, about reducing the amount of institutional churn and improving institutional memory.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the scientific structure. Now, we had our own series of papers. We called it our own COVID inquiry papers, in which in each paper we ended up by posing a set of questions that the inquiry might want to ask. But it was focused on the scientific structure in relation to how that informed government and how it informed politicians. And Martin McKee, who's a professor of European Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who's also a member of Independent SAGE, which was this independent group that offered advice kind of in parallel to the official advice that the government was receiving from its own advisors. He authored an editorial that went with that inquiry. We're just going to hear him talk to our producer, Duncan Jarvis.
The report talks about the way in which SAGE would be asked questions without necessarily knowing why they were being asked those questions. And then when they gave the answers, they would not get feedback as to whether their answers had been of any use. Members of SAGE have spoken on the record about how, in the case of care homes, they had really no idea about the practical arrangements in care homes that members of staff could work in different care homes in the same week. And they've said that had they known that, they would have designed their models differently. So I think that highlights the importance of having that interaction, to know that when someone asks you a question as a scientist, you know why they're asking it. But that doesn't mean that you want to be party political. You need to understand where the questions are coming from.
And you mentioned there the difference between politics and party politics. And Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister at the time, it seems like was engaging very much in party politics. His sort of boosterism around Brexit and the UK being able to do its own thing, and made him very unwilling to listen to other countries, to follow what was being advised elsewhere.
I think there were practical issues here in that our links to particularly the European Centre for Disease Control and to our neighbours in Europe, but also more widely, had broken down as a result of Brexit. Brexit had many impacts on the pandemic. First of all, a very large proportion of the work of the civil service was dedicated to, quote, getting Brexit done, unquote. And that's been identified by parliamentary committees, particularly before, less prominent in this report, but it's been highlighted before. But I think the second issue, and it may well come out, in fact, I know that it will come out in later modules, one of which I gave evidence to, where we were looking where things were happening elsewhere. Parliamentary committees have issued a number of reports pointing out the failure to look at what was happening in East Asia in particular, where there was a lot of expertise. I work in many other European countries and I see it work far better. The fact that people like myself can have really in-depth conversations with ministers in other European countries, with people that I really respect because they really understand the issues. And I can't imagine doing that in the United Kingdom or in England.
That was Martin McKee from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Kevin, I think probably just a final point. You're a systems person. Systems should be learning. I mean, how do you get a system like the politico-scientific system to learn from this and do better next time?
So it's very difficult with this inquiry. It's important. It's important, and we are spending a huge amount of money on it, but when are you ever going to see an event like this? This is the biggest national emergency since World War II. It is the only event of this type that will ever be documented in the way that this was. No one is ever going to use WhatsApp ever again thinking that it is a secure way to message one another. So it is forensic in the detail we will have from it. So it's like the Rosetta Stone of events for us to learn from here. The things that we must learn is, firstly, we want to assign blame here. We want to find people who should be on the hook. I think that is understandable. But the interests of learning are served by saying, just let's be honest about where we did well and where we did badly. That's the only thing we can do now in the service of the future. There are some specific things to pick out from Module 2's report that are important. The first is this. From the point of view of the National Health Service, it was all about its capacity to absorb the increased demand for healthcare that resulted from COVID. Baroness Hallett talks about the possibility that 23,000 lives may have been saved had we gone into measures earlier, just a week earlier. What isn't said is that those 23,000 deaths excess deaths would have been also accompanied by many tens of thousands of additional hospital admissions that were focused on a very small number of geographies, so massively increasing the strain there. That's the first specific lesson. Second, it is interesting that they say that lockdown may have been avoided. I almost think that it's distracting to talk about that because the word may is doing a lot of work there. I think it may have been avoided if we'd gone earlier and you had an intact ability to surveil the disease and then to contain and isolate. I think Module 1 tells you had 9 of those capacities. Thirdly, I think it's about your ability to learn from what is happening in front of you. And Baroness Hallett's very clear in Module 2 report, this is a government that didn't learn. And so was too little too late, not just in March, in February and March, but also in subsequent waves throughout the country, particularly on the run-up into January the 4th. And then finally, really, it's about what the central message of this is. Forget about it. Strip out the politics. That government is gone, and this is about the future. And for me, the takeaway from Module 2 is, if you are honestly, I have very little regard for what the reputation of these people is who are involved in the decision making. There are people out there with much more at stake than their reputations, and this is about protecting the future. And so if you are listening to this podcast 10, 20, 30 years into the future, wondering what you're going to do if something brews somewhere else in the world, the message is given to you by Patrick Valence's evidence. So Patrick Valence's evidence as chief scientific advisor of the time, which is, in the face of a pandemic like this, you must enact social restrictions earlier, harder, and more broadly than you would like. And I think that is the key message to future governments. You have to have some humility in the face of this. You have to be able to act before it's obvious to the man or woman in the street that it's coming, and otherwise you'll pay the price, and we have.
Good. Thank you very much. A final question for you, Matthew, which is, I think you started with this and you expressed some surprise that Baroness Hallett has been so strong in her kind of judgments. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, Baroness Hallett has a very detailed understanding of the social impact that it's had, and also its long-term reverberations for public trust and confidence in the British state and its processes. I hope that what we will see is almost an end to what the report lays bare, which is a kind of a good chap's theory of government, which is very amateurish. It isn't good at listening. It isn't very good at learning. But the challenge here is that essentially moving towards that systems thinking, that strategic policy planning, is anathema to the current culture of Whitehall. So my great worry is that actually, although we've had the COVID crisis, it won't drive systemic change to the level and the extent that's actually needed to prevent something like this happening again.
Okay, well, I think we're probably hoping it doesn't happen again. But thank you very much for your time today. That's it for this special episode of the Medicine and Science podcast from the BMJ. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our regular episodes. Until we meet again, I'm Cameron Abbasi. Thanks for listening.